to steer the kingdom. Yet through a mixture of ancient succession law and the sheer paralysis of her rivals, the crown had landed on her head. Her kingdom was not a great one by the standards of the age. Nestled between mountain passes and fertile plains, it was a small but wealthy prize, one that had long paid tribute to the vast empire to the east. That empire, older than her own dynasty, had risen on the backs of legions and trade caravans, swallowing lands from the southern deserts to the cold northern steppes. They called themselves the stewards of civilization. Their neighbors knew them as an unending hunger in marble and steel. Her father had kept the peace by bending just enough to survive, sending gold, grain, and soldiers when the imperial demand came. Now, word had reached the capital that the emperor himself had taken an interest in her ascension. Officially, the imperial envoys came to congratulate the new queen and renew the terms of tribute. Unofficially, they came to measure her like a lamb before the slaughter, too young, too inexperienced, too alone to resist incorporation into the empire. The queen's first council meeting had been a baptism by fire. The great hall was crowded with men twice her age, their silk robes brushing the marble floor, their voices sharp with advice and accusation. One urged her to accept the empire's terms without hesitation. Another demanded an immediate mobilization of the army, even though the treasury could not afford it. A third whispered that a royal marriage could save the kingdom, if she chose the right groom from the right foreign house. Every proposal was laced with self-interest. Every ally had the potential to become her executioner. In that chamber, she had remained silent longer than was comfortable. Let them think me unsure, she thought. Let them fill the air with their plans until they've said too much. Her father had once told her, a ruler's first weapon is not the sword but the pause. It was advice she clung to now as her heart pounded in her chest. The political reality was brutal. The empire had crushed kingdoms twice her size with armies twice her strength. Its generals commanded forces that could outmatch hers 10-1. Its diplomats had perfected the art of turning a rival's allies into willing betrayers. If she resisted outright, she risked the annihilation of her people. If she submitted, she would become little more than an ornament in the emperor's court, her crown a hollow relic. But what the empire did not yet understand was that she had no intention of playing the role they had assigned her. She had grown up in a palace where survival depended on reading the subtlest shifts in expression, where every banquet hid rivalries and every gesture carried meaning. She had watched her brothers speak boldly in public, only to be undone by what they didn't see in the shadows. So when the imperial ultimatum arrived, delivered on parchment stamped with the emperor's seal and scented faintly with the oils of his court, she read it once, then again, then set it aside. They will expect a reply in 7 days, her chamberlain told her, his voice low. If we delay, they will take it as defiance. She only nodded. She would give them her reply, but not the one they anticipated. That night, she walked alone through the torchlit corridors of the palace, past the painted frescoes of kings and queens long gone. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the distant murmur of guards. She paused before a mosaic depicting her kingdom's founding, a woman warrior, spear in hand, standing atop the ramparts against an invading host. Her father had once said that the image was more myth than history. But myths, she now understood, were as much a weapon as any blade. By morning, the court would see a queen who appeared to waver, unsure of which counsel to follow. The empire would believe they were dealing with a frightened child. And that was exactly what she wanted. For in the game she was about to play, underestimation was not a weakness. It was the opening move. Far beyond the mountain passes, past the rolling plains where caravans moved like ants across the horizon, the heart of the empire pulsed with quiet menace. Its capital was a city of impossible scale, avenues so wide that 6 horse-drawn chariots could race abreast, markets spilling with silks from the east and spices from the south, and marble palaces whose columns seemed carved from clouds. Here, decisions were made that toppled kings. Here, the fate of the teenage queen's kingdom would be sealed. The empire did not rise overnight. For centuries, it had been a cluster of warring states, united first by a cunning warlord who ruled not just with the sword but with the promise of prosperity. Successive emperors expanded those borders through a mixture of calculated diplomacy and unrelenting military campaigns. By the queen's time, the empire was not merely a political entity, it was an idea. To its citizens, it was the bringer of order. To its enemies, it was the inevitable tide. The imperial army was the jewel of its power, a disciplined, professional force unlike the seasonal militias of smaller realms. Soldiers were drilled year-round, their armor standardized, their formations precise. Supply lines stretched like veins across the land, ensuring that armies could march for months without famine or disarray. Even the empire's banners, deep crimson embroidered with the golden sun, were chosen for psychological effect, a reminder that their reach was as constant and inescapable as daylight. Yet perhaps more dangerous than its armies was its network of envoys and spies. Imperial ambassadors traveled with entourages of scribes, merchants, and scholars, but among them were always those whose true purpose was to measure the vulnerabilities of foreign courts. They noted which noble favored which faction, which merchant had debts, which general had grievances. This intelligence would then be fed back to the imperial council, where it became the basis for offers that could not be refused, or threats that could not be ignored. The emperor who now sat upon the throne was no idle monarch. He was a man in his late 40s, his face weathered from years spent not in pleasure gardens but on campaign trails. He had inherited an empire already vast and had expanded it still further, using both siegecraft and silver to bring rival rulers under his banner. His philosophy was simple: a neighbor not subdued today would become a threat tomorrow. To him, the young queen's kingdom was not an ally, it was unfinished business. When word reached him of her ascension, his council debated briefly before agreeing on the course. The kingdom's tribute payments, while modest, were vital for funding campaigns in the west. More importantly, the mountain passes it controlled were a strategic artery for moving troops. If this new ruler was weak, the empire could annex her realm with minimal resistance. If she proved troublesome, an accidental border incident could provide cause for war. So the emperor dispatched an envoy of high standing, accompanied by a small but visible escort of imperial soldiers. They would arrive in full ceremonial splendor, polished armor gleaming, gifts of gold and fine horses in tow, to remind the queen of the might she faced. Their official purpose was to congratulate her. Their real mission was to assess her weaknesses and deliver the emperor's ultimatum: renew tribute on harsher terms, or lose everything. The journey to her capital was a calculated display. Villages along the route were instructed to prepare feasts and celebrations for the imperial party. Local leaders were summoned to greet the envoy, reinforcing the image that even far from its heart, the empire's presence was a daily reality. By the time the envoy crossed into her court, his arrival was not that of a mere messenger, it was the shadow of the emperor himself stretching across her land. In the capital, preparations were frantic. The queen's advisors urged her to receive the envoy with the full honors accorded to a conqueror. Some warned that even the smallest breach of etiquette could be taken as an insult. Others whispered that showing too much deference would only hasten the empire's grip. When the imperial envoy finally entered the throne room, the moment felt less like a diplomatic visit and more like a siege without walls. His eyes swept the court with the precision of a man counting assets. He bowed deeply, but there was no warmth in the gesture. And then, in a voice smooth as polished steel, he spoke the emperor's terms, polite enough to pass for an offer, yet heavy with the promise of ruin. The shadow had arrived. The imperial envoy's presence lingered in the palace like a storm cloud. Courtiers who once argued loudly in council now spoke in measured tones, afraid their words might carry to the wrong ears. Every movement in the great hall, every sidelong glance, felt like part of a larger, unseen game. And at the center of it sat the teenage queen, still smiling, still gracious, yet quietly calculating each step. She knew the empire expected her to answer quickly. But speed favored them. Delay favored her. And so, under the guise of due ceremony, she extended the negotiations. The imperial delegation was treated to feasts, hunts, and cultural performances, each designed to occupy their days without offering a final answer. It was a dangerous balancing act: stall too long and they might take offense, move too soon and she'd play her hand before the board was set. Behind the scenes, she began to gather information. Her spies, young pages, overlooked servants, even merchants who supplied the imperial entourage, fed her scraps of conversation from the envoy's private chambers. From these fragments, she learned of their impatience, their belief that her court was fractured, and their confidence that victory was inevitable. That arrogance was her first weapon. But the court itself was as much a battlefield as any open plain. Her nobles were divided into factions, those who feared the empire and urged submission, and those who believed a show of defiance would rally allies. Each side courted her favor, yet neither trusted her entirely. She played them against one another, granting small concessions to both while never revealing her true intentions. By allowing their rivalries to occupy their energy, she kept their eyes off the moves she was making elsewhere. Cultural tradition became another shield. She invoked the kingdom's long-standing rights of succession and mourning, insisting that no foreign policy decision could be finalized until the full mourning period for her father was observed. Publicly, she cited respect for the ancestors; privately, it bought her precious weeks. The envoy could not openly object without insulting her people's beliefs, a misstep the empire preferred to avoid when conquest was still the goal. Even the smallest gestures were calculated. At banquets, she ensured the envoy was seated at her right hand, a sign of respect, yet she wore the sword of her late brother strapped at her side, a silent reminder that she was not without defense. She toasted the emperor with honeyed words, but always in the plural, to the empire's wisdom and prosperity, never singling out his name as supreme. In letters dispatched under seal to neighboring rulers, she began hinting at a possible imperial invasion. Not in panicked pleas for aid, but in subtle warnings that such a conquest would shift the balance of power in ways unfavorable to them. These messages were crafted to plant seeds that might sprout into alliances, or at least discourage neighboring states from aiding the empire. And so the days turned into weeks, the envoy's smile thinning as the queen continued her dance. Every pause, every delay, every gentle deflection was a thread in the web she was weaving. The empire believed they were circling their prey. She knew she was drawing them in. By the third week of the envoy's stay, the queen had learned enough to act. Every conversation, every shift in tone, every glance between the imperial officers had been studied, dissected, and stored away. She knew their strengths, but more importantly, she knew their blind spots. The empire's confidence in its inevitability had made them careless. Her first move was one of appearances. She announced a series of royal inspections across her realm, public tours to reaffirm her bond with the people. To the envoy, it appeared a naive display of popularity, a distraction from the serious business of diplomacy. In truth, it allowed her to discreetly visit the mountain passes, assess the fortifications, and give covert orders to the garrisons stationed there. She disguised military preparations as civic repairs, sending engineers to reinforce bridges that happened to be key choke points and ordering market expansions that doubled as troop mustering grounds. Her second move was subtler still. Through trusted merchants, she arranged to sell vast quantities of surplus grain and metal to trading partners further west, nations that had been watching the empire's advance with unease. The sales were public, but the contracts contained clauses that, in the event of an imperial invasion, those same goods would be diverted back to her in exchange for favorable trade terms. It was a hidden reserve of supplies, one the empire would not expect from a realm its scribes described as resource poor. Marriage diplomacy, the oldest tool in a monarch's arsenal, became her third weapon. She sent delicate, ambiguous letters to several minor royal houses, not outright proposals, but hints of openness. To each, she implied that the empire's growing shadow threatened them all and that a binding alliance through her marriage might prove their best insurance. She had no intention of marrying yet, but the possibility alone stirred unease in the imperial council, which feared the sudden rise of a coalition. While these moves unfolded, she planted her most dangerous seed, misinformation. Using servants who could pass unnoticed, she ensured that false reports reached the envoy's ears, rumors of unrest in distant parts of her kingdom, whispers of court members plotting to depose her, tales of her supposed hesitation to rule. To the envoy, this was confirmation of her weakness. It fed the imperial assumption that her realm could be taken with minimal resistance. And yet, with each passing day, the envoy's soldiers noticed something odd. Roads they traveled grew narrower and more winding. Supplies from the countryside reached them slower, their convoys mysteriously delayed by floods or fallen trees. None of it seemed significant on its own, but together it was the tightening of a noose. Her final gambit came at a grand banquet held in the envoy's honor. The hall was filled with music and candlelight, the tables laden with delicacies from across the kingdom. As the feast reached its height, the queen rose and, with all the ceremony of a ruler paying tribute, presented the envoy with a lavish gift, a set of gold-inlaid maps of her kingdom's terrain. The envoy, believing it a token of submission, accepted them with a smile. But the maps were deliberate fabrications. While they appeared accurate, certain mountain passes were misplaced, key water sources omitted, and false roads inserted. Should the empire act on them, their armies would find themselves funneled into exposed valleys or led into dead ends, perfect ambush sites. To the court, it was a display of magnanimity. To the empire, it was a sign that the young queen was ready to comply. But to her closest allies, few as they were, it was the quiet moment when the game shifted. The trap was not meant to win her a battle. It was meant to make the empire commit itself to one it could not fight cleanly. Every maneuver, every deception, every carefully timed delay had been building toward this, forcing the empire into a position where war would be costly, alliances uncertain, and the political risk too great for even the emperor to stomach. When the banquet ended, the envoy left the hall satisfied. The queen returned to her chambers alone, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. The stage was set. The envoy's return to the imperial camp beyond the city walls was marked by quiet confidence. He carried the queen's tribute gift of maps and ceremonial promises, believing his mission nearly complete. His reports, sent ahead by swift riders, assured the emperor that the young ruler would bend without a fight. But by the time those reports reached the imperial capital, the first threads of her web had begun to tighten. The empire's forces stationed along the border in readiness for occupation began moving according to the faulty maps. Supply trains took the shortest routes and found themselves bottlenecked in steep, narrow passes. Cavalry detachments were delayed for days when rivers they'd been told were shallow turned out to be swollen and impassable. Scouts sent to reconnoiter the queen's lands returned with conflicting information, some describing thriving markets, others claiming villages stood empty. Confusion bred hesitation, and hesitation cost the empire its greatest weapon, momentum. Meanwhile, the queen's letters, those careful, suggestive messages to neighboring rulers, had borne fruit. Word reached the imperial officers that two minor kingdoms to the west had begun reinforcing their own borders, fearing that the empire's advance in one direction would lead to sudden expansion in another. The emperor now faced the possibility of fighting not a single small kingdom but a coalition. Inside the imperial camp, morale began to erode. Merchants from the queen's realm arrived daily with grain, textiles, and wines, speaking openly of her generosity and the prosperity of her people. These tales, true or not, seeped into the ears of soldiers and minor officers, softening the image of the enemy. To destroy such a ruler, some began to whisper, might only turn more of the region against the empire. The final stroke came not from the battlefield, but from the capital itself. The queen, under the banner of diplomacy, sent the envoy back to the emperor bearing a renewed tribute agreement, one that appeared generous, even deferential. In truth, its terms were a masterpiece of ambiguity, pledges of goods already committed elsewhere, offers of cooperation contingent on seasonal conditions, and clauses requiring lengthy negotiations before any troop movement through her territory could occur. It was the perfect political trap. To reject the agreement outright would make the empire appear the aggressor, risking unrest among its own allies. To accept it meant conceding to a peace that gave the queen breathing room, time to fortify her position further. Faced with the choice, the emperor chose delay, a decision that, in imperial politics, was as good as retreat. Troops were quietly withdrawn from the border under the guise of redeployment. The envoy's mission was declared a success, and the queen's realm was left untouched. No arrows had flown, no sieges had been laid, yet the outcome was clear. The young queen had forced the empire to back away without losing her sovereignty, or her dignity. And in the echoing silence that followed, her legend began to take root. In the months that followed, the mountain passes grew quiet again. Traders resumed their routes, bringing tales of a young monarch who had stared down the most powerful empire of her age and emerged unscathed. The story spread far beyond her borders, carried by merchants, wandering poets, and diplomats, each retelling bending slightly toward legend. In neighboring courts, rulers began to reconsider their own stance toward the empire. Some found courage in her defiance, seeing that even the largest power could be held at bay without a battle. Others sought her friendship, hoping her cunning might one day serve their cause. The queen, never one to waste an opportunity, cultivated these relationships with the same quiet precision she had shown in her first trial. Within her own kingdom, she became more than a ruler. She was a symbol, a living reminder that sovereignty could be preserved through wit as surely as through arms. The people called her the Iron Rose for her beauty and grace, masking the unyielding strength beneath. Festivals began to honor the day the imperial army turned away, though no official decree named it a victory. She understood better than most that triumph sometimes thrived in the absence of spectacle. Historians writing decades later would debate the truth of her methods. Some would claim the empire had simply been distracted by other campaigns, that she had been lucky rather than brilliant. Others would argue that her psychological mastery of the envoy, her manipulation of geography, and her quiet weaving of alliances had permanently altered the political map. She reigned for many years after that first confrontation, guiding her kingdom through seasons of famine and years of plenty, always mindful that the empire's shadow still loomed beyond the mountains. But it never returned in force. Whether through respect, caution, or the emperor's unwillingness to risk another humiliation, her realm remained her own. In time, the queen's story took on the timeless glow of myth. To some, she was the clever girl who deceived an entire empire. To others, she was the proof that youth and inexperience need not be weaknesses. And to all who told her tale, she was the queen who could not be broken, because she had learned that the sharpest crown was the one forged in the mind. And as long as her story was remembered, so too was the lesson: in the great games of history, victory does not always belong to the strongest, it belongs to the one who refuses to play by the enemy's rules.